I can still remember that drive home during fall break of my sophomore year like it was yesterday. Normally, I stayed on campus during short breaks. After all, it was easier than making the 12-hour trek back to Louisiana. But my sister just had a baby, and I wanted to meet my new niece. That's why, on a chilly October morning, I packed up my car, set an early alarm, and hit the road before dawn, hoping to make it home before dark. The first half of the trip was smooth, almost too easy. The roads were clear, the weather was perfect, and I was making great time. I even thought I might get home earlier than planned. But all of that changed as I crested a hill and saw a long line of cars stopped ahead of me. I slowed down, squinting to see how far the traffic jam stretched, but it went on further than I could see. I pulled out my phone and checked the traffic app. There had been a bad accident, and the entire highway was shut down. My stomach sank. I knew this would set me back hours, and the idea of spending a night at some roadside motel didn't appeal to me at all. Then I noticed an exit ramp just up ahead. I zoomed out on my GPS, trying to see where the exit might lead. It seemed to snake around through the countryside, but generally headed in the direction I needed to go. Without giving it too much thought, I pulled onto the shoulder, drove past the stopped cars, and took the exit. For a while, I felt good about the decision. I was moving again, and the road was peaceful, winding through thick woods with no other cars in sight. But after about 20 minutes, I noticed something strange. My GPS kept telling me to turn around. I ignored it, figuring it would reroute me soon enough. But the further I went, the more remote the area became. The occasional building I passed looked abandoned, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly into the wilderness. I started to get that uneasy feeling you get when you know you've made a mistake. I grabbed my phone to check the GPS again, but now there was no signal, and the map wouldn't load. My frustration grew. I debated turning around but hesitated. I didn't want to lose any more time. As I was mulling it over, something caught my eye on the side of the road. A little girl stood there, just off the shoulder, staring directly at me. I hit the brakes, my heart thudding in my chest. Why was there a little girl out here, in the middle of nowhere? She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, wearing a simple white dress that seemed out of place against the backdrop of the dying trees. I didn't even have time to wonder if I should stop my car before there was a loud bang from underneath my car. I felt the vehicle lurch forward and struggled to keep control as I slowed to a stop. I got out and walked around to the passenger side, already fearing the worst. Sure enough, my front tire was completely blown. A jagged piece of metal was lodged in the rubber, making it clear this wasn't something I could just patch up. As I stared at the ruined tire, I suddenly remembered the little girl. My attention had been so focused on her that I hadn't seen the metal in the road. But when I looked back to where she'd been standing, she was gone. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of her. I knew I hadn't imagined it. She was there, as clear as day, but now she was nowhere to be found. Something wasn't right about this place. I decided to change the tire as quickly as possible and get out of there. I popped the trunk, pulled out the spare, and started jacking up the car. As I was loosening the lug nuts, I heard a faint rustling in the woods behind me. I froze, listening. The trees were thick, and the light was beginning to fade, making it hard to see anything beyond the first few rows of trunks. I waited, but when nothing else happened, I shook it off and went back to work, moving faster now. That's when I heard it, a soft, trembling voice calling out for help. I turned towards the sound, my heart pounding. It was the little girl. She was somewhere in the woods, her voice so weak I could barely hear her. I yelled out to her, asking if she was okay and where she was. There was a silence for a moment. Then the voice came again, a little stronger this time, but still far away. She was saying she needed help and to come here. Every instinct in my body screamed at me that something was wrong, but I couldn't just leave a kid out there. I shouted back, asking if she could come to the road. I was still hoping she'd appear, but there was no response. I glanced at the tire. I only had one lug nut left to tighten. I finished the tire as quickly as I could, grabbed the tire iron, and cautiously stepped towards the woods. As I entered the tree line, I called out again, but this time there was no answer. I took a few more steps in, my heart racing. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard her voice again. She said she saw me, and to keep walking. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. The way she said it, so calm, so certain, sent chills down my spine. I looked around, but saw nothing but trees and darkness. How could she see me when I couldn't see but 15 feet in front of me? I knew then that something was very, very wrong. I turned on my heel and sprinted back to the car, not caring about the noise I made. I threw open the driver's door, jumped in, and started the engine. I didn't even bother to check my mirrors as I made a U-turn and sped back the way I'd come. As I tore down the road, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw them. Standing in the middle of the road was a man dressed in black, his face obscured by the shadows. The little girl emerged from the woods and stood next to him, her eyes fixed on my car as I sped away. They didn't move, didn't try to follow, just stood there, watching. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway and finally got a signal on my phone. I called 911 and told them everything. They assured me they sent someone to check it out, but when they called back later, they said they hadn't found anyone. No man, no girl, no signs of anyone at all. To this day, I still wonder what they wanted, why they were trying to lure me into the woods. But every time I think about that moment, when I saw them standing there, I can't help but feel relieved that I didn't stick around to find out. I remember the night of that business trip like it was yesterday. I had a big meeting the next day, a chance to make an impression on upper management and potentially land a lead position on a new project. The destination was only about 4 hours away, so I figured I'd drive there after work, check into a hotel late at night, and wake up refreshed, ready to seize the opportunity. I packed my bags the night before and left the office as soon as I could, eager to hit the road. I decided to take the scenic route. Highways always made me anxious, and I needed a clear head to mentally prepare for the next day. The first couple hours were peaceful. I listened to a podcast, thought through what I'd say at the meeting, and enjoyed the tranquility of the countryside. It was about an hour before I was supposed to be at my destination, and the sun was just about to set. I was driving down a 2-lane back road when I saw flashing lights up ahead. I slowed down, trying to figure out what was going on. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't an accident, just a car with its flashers on. I moved to the middle of the road to give them some space, almost coming to a complete stop as I passed. That's when I saw them, a young couple, standing in front of the car talking. The man noticed me first and waved, signaling for me to stop. Against my better judgment, I rolled down the passenger window and asked if they were okay. The man walked over to the window, almost sticking his head inside. He said they were having car trouble and asked if I can give them a lift to the next town. Normally, I wouldn't give rides to strangers, but it was almost dark and this road didn't seem to get much traffic. I hesitated, but the thought of leaving them stranded nagged at my conscience. I offered to call a tow truck instead, but the man quickly interjected, saying he'd already called one, but it wouldn't arrive until morning. All they needed was a ride to the town up the road where they could stay the night. I looked back at their car. It was a Chevy Impala, maybe 3 years old, and didn't seem damaged. I couldn't understand why it wouldn't start, but I figured I'd feel guilty if I left them there. I glanced over at the girl. She looked scared, younger than I expected, maybe just out of her teens. My conscience got the better of me. I told the man that I'd give him a ride. He thanked me profusely and then went back to speak with the girl. I couldn't hear what he said, but she nodded, went to the trunk to grab a backpack, and then climbed into the back seat. The man grabbed another bag from the trunk before getting into the passenger seat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I pushed it aside and started driving. The man kept up a steady stream of small talk as we drove, asking me all sorts of questions, where I was headed, what I did for work, and if I had traveled often. He told me his name was Chad. I answered politely but vaguely, not wanting to give too much away about myself. I kept glancing at the girl in the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her expression still tense and uneasy. She hadn't said a word since getting in the car. At first, I figured she was just shaken up from being stranded, but the longer I drove, the more I wondered why she didn't seem relieved now that they were on their way to safety. I turned slightly in my seat and asked her what her name was. She looked at Chad before answering in a quiet voice. She said her name was Claire. I told her it was nice to meet her, but she didn't respond. The atmosphere in the car was growing more uncomfortable by the minute. I asked where they were headed, and Chad said they were on their way to California to see some family. I commented that their car trouble must be putting them behind schedule. The man nodded, muttering that he knew he shouldn't have bought that piece of crap Ford. My stomach tightened. I knew there was something wrong. Their car wasn't a Ford, it was a Chevy. I glanced in the mirror at Claire again, and this time she was staring right back at me, her eyes wide with fear. It was then I realized the man had made a slip, a mistake that sent a wave of panic through me. I asked the man how long he'd owned the Ford. He went on about how he'd bought it a couple years ago and he'd always had bad luck with Fords. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. This man wasn't who he said he was, and Claire was clearly terrified. We were just coming into the town when an idea struck me. I asked if I could buy them dinner before I got back on the road, pretending I was hungry. I figured if I can get them into somewhere public, I could forget my wallet in the car and call the police to come do a welfare check. Chad hesitated, glancing back at Claire, who looked even more frightened. He declined, saying that they just wanted to get some rest. As we drove into the town, I spotted a small hotel. Chad told me I could drop them off there. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands trembling. Chad got out first, but Claire stayed in the back seat, unmoving. He opened her door and in a stern voice told her to get out. She looked at me one last time through the mirror before stepping out of the car. I watched them walk towards the motel's front door, but noticed they weren't going inside. Instead, he grabbed Claire's wrist and started pulling her to the side of the building. Without hesitating, I pulled out my phone and called 911, explaining what had just happened and that I thought the girl was in danger. As I spoke to the dispatcher, Chad looked back and made eye contact with me. His expression darkened. He tightened his grip on Claire's wrist and quickened his pace around the back of the building. I begged the dispatcher to send help quickly. Within minutes, 2 police cars pulled into the parking lot and I pointed to the direction they had gone. The officers told me to stay in the car as they went after them. Several agonizing minutes passed before I saw them emerge with Chad in handcuffs. Claire was with the other officer, her face pale but relieved. I got out of the car as she ran towards me, tears streaming down her face. She hugged me tightly, repeating, "Thank you," over and over. It turned out that Claire and Chad had been dating, but he had become abusive. When she tried to break up with him, he refused to let her go, threatening to harm her and her family. He had forced her to leave home and had stolen the Chevy. Apparently, the only problem with the car was that it ran out of gas. When I stopped, Chad had threatened to kill me if Claire didn't keep quiet. Claire and I still keep in touch. I'm thankful every day that I decided to stop and help, because I shudder to think what might have happened to her if I didn't. Some people tell crazy stories that happen to them, stories of near-death experiences, ghosts, and the paranormal. But then, there are stories like mine. Stories that don't quite fit into any category, and they leave a mark on you. One that you can't forget, even if you wanted to. I've told a few people this story, and the ones who listened, well, let's just say they don't talk to me much anymore. It was just a normal night, the same as any other boring night of my boring life. I worked third shift at a factory, but it was the weekend and I was off. My wife was already in bed after a long day at the grocery store, and our son was out with friends, like he often did on weekends. I was sitting on the couch, half watching some late night TV, when I glanced at my watch. Almost 11 p.m. It wasn't unusual for our son to stay out late, but he usually checked in. Tonight, though, I hadn't heard a word from him. I figured I'd send him a quick text to make sure everything was okay, and see what time he planned on coming home. Just a routine check. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. A few minutes had passed, and my phone rang. It was him, calling me back. But the second I answered, I knew something was off. The line was distorted, full of static, but I could hear my son's voice underneath it all. I asked him what was wrong, but all I could make out were fragments. His car broke down and he needed help. I kept asking him where he was, but the static only got worse. Then, suddenly, it stopped, and in a brief moment of clarity, I heard him say 2 words as clear as day: Mills Farm. Then the line went dead. Mills Farm was an old, abandoned farmstead out in the middle of nowhere. Why would he be there? It made no sense, but I didn't have time to think about it. I just grabbed my keys, threw on my jacket, and ran out to the car. The drive was long and dark, and I was trying not to worry. Our son was smart and responsible, more so than most kids his age. But as I neared Mills Farm, a sense of dread crept over me. Something felt wrong. I slowed down as I approached the turnoff for the farm, scanning the road for any signs of his car. Then, just up ahead, I saw it. Parked on the side of the road, no lights on, and not even hazards. I pulled up behind it and got out, calling his name, but no response. As I walked closer, I noticed the car was definitely his, but something seemed off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew something wasn't right. I opened the driver's side door and looked inside. No sign of him, no keys either. I called his name again, louder this time, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. I turned my gaze towards the field. There, looming in the darkness, was the old Mills barn. It looked even more decrepit than I remembered, like it could collapse at any minute. I had a bad feeling about this, but I just couldn't leave. Maybe he went into the barn for shelter or something. I started walking towards it. As I got closer, I heard a strange humming noise. It seemed to be coming from within inside the barn. I called out for my son, but there was still no answer. When I reached the barn doors, I tried pulling them open, but they wouldn't even budge. I walked around the building, trying to find another way in. Eventually, I found a section of the wall that had caved in. It was just big enough for me to squeeze through, so I did. Inside, it was pitch dark, but that humming sound was even louder now, almost vibrating through the walls. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The dim beam was just enough for me to see. I made my way towards the center of the barn, my eyes scanned for any sign of my son. But instead, I found something else. Standing in the middle of the room was a door. Just a door. It wasn't attached to anything, just standing there upright, as if it had been plucked from a house and dropped right in the middle of the barn. A soft light seeped from underneath the door, and the humming was definitely coming from behind it. I walked around it, but there was nothing behind it, just the rotting wood of the barn floor. But when I stepped back in front, I felt this pull, like something was drawing me to it. My hand reached out before I could stop myself. The doorknob was ice cold. I twisted it slowly and pulled the door open just a crack. What I saw on the other side wasn't the empty barn. It was something else. A swampy, dark landscape, the ground slick with mud and water. The air was thick with fog, and trees with twisted, gnarled branches reached out like claws. But there, in the distance, was the source of the humming. A creature, slowly rising from the murky water. It was like something out of a nightmare, with scales glistening in the dim light and long, spendy limbs that ended in sharp claws. It had no eyes that I could see, but I could feel it staring right at me. Before I could react, it let out a blood-curdling scream and started charging towards the door. I slammed it shut, my heart pounding, but I could still hear it on the other side, slamming against the door, trying to break through. I ran. I didn't stop to think or look back. I just ran as fast as I could, back to the hole in the wall, back to my car. I heard one last thunderous crash as I bolted through the opening, but I didn't dare turn around. Then, everything suddenly went black. I was in such a hurry, I didn't see the beam that had partially fallen from the ceiling. I hit it so hard that it knocked me out cold. I don't know how long I lay there on the ground, but when I finally got up, the sun was just starting to rise. Everything was quiet. I walked back to the barn, slowly and cautiously. When I reached the center of the room, there was nothing there. No door, no light, no creature. Just an empty, rotting barn. When I got back to my car, I saw I had several missed calls from my wife and son. I called him back, and he picked up immediately, asking me where I was and why I hadn't come home. I told him I'd been at Mill's farm, and that he called me for help because his car broke down. But he said he never called me, and his car was just fine. I wanted to argue that he had called me, but honestly, with everything I just experienced, or thought I experienced, that night, my son was not actually calling me was the least unexplainable thing. I ended up just telling my family that I went for a night drive and pulled over because I was exhausted and that I just had an awful dream. I could tell they didn't believe my story, but what was I going to tell them? That I got a mysterious call from my not son that led me to a door that led to a nightmare and a monster tried to kill me? To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I don't talk about it, not to anyone. How could I? Who would believe me when I don't even know what to believe myself? The only thing I know is that I hope I never see that door again, because if I do, I'm not sure I'll be able to close it a second time.